It was 2:47 p.m. on Thanksgiving when my Uncle Marcus slammed his fist on the dining room table so hard the gravy boat jumped and spilled across my grandmother's lace tablecloth. The sound cut through the warm chatter like a gunshot, and suddenly, 8 pairs of eyes were staring at me like I'd just committed treason. My heart hammered against my ribs, that familiar combat-ready alertness flooding my system, even though I was sitting in a suburban dining room in Ohio, not dodging mortars. In Afghanistan. "Get out!" Marcus snarled, his face purple with rage as he pointed toward the front door. "You don't deserve to sit at this table with decent people, not after what you've done to your own family." The words hit me like a physical blow, but what really knocked the wind out of me was the chorus of nods around the table. My own family, people I'd sent money to from overseas, people I'd worried about during those long, terrifying nights in Kandahar, were all agreeing with him. Even my mother, who used to send me care packages filled with homemade cookies and letters telling me how proud she was, wouldn't meet my eyes. That's when I started laughing. Not the kind of laugh you hear at comedy shows or family gatherings. This was the laugh that bubbles up when your brain short-circuits from too much betrayal hitting you at once. It was the same laugh I'd heard from soldiers who'd been shot and couldn't quite process that their own body was bleeding out beneath them. The laughter stopped them cold. My cousin Jennifer, who'd been filming the whole thing on her phone like this was some kind of reality TV drama, actually lowered her camera. My grandfather, the man who'd taught me how to tie my shoes and ride a bike, looked genuinely confused for the first time since I'd walked through that door 3 hours earlier. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. My legs felt steady beneath me, steadier than they'd felt in months. All those years of military training, of standing at attention while drill sergeants screamed in my face, of maintaining composure under enemy fire, had prepared me for this moment in ways I'd never imagined. "You want me to leave?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. The question hung in the air like smoke from a spent shell casing. Around the table, faces that had once smiled at me over birthday cakes and Christmas mornings now looked cold, almost alien. These were supposed to be my people, my blood, my safety net, when the world got too heavy to carry alone. My Aunt Patricia, who'd been the loudest voice demanding I help pay for my cousin Tyler's latest failed business venture, crossed her arms, over her chest. "After what you did, refusing to help family when we needed you most, you're lucky we even invited you today." The irony wasn't lost on me. Lucky they invited me. To the house I'd been quietly paying the mortgage on for the past 2 years. To the Thanksgiving dinner funded by groceries I'd helped purchase through the anonymous money transfers I'd been sending. To sit at the table I'd helped buy through my VA disability checks and deployment savings, while they treated me like I was the family leech. I could feel something shifting inside my chest, like tectonic plates moving after years of pressure. For so long, I'd been the invisible daughter, the one who came home from deployment broken and quiet, who sent money without being asked, who listened to everyone's problems but never talked about the nightmares that woke me up screaming. I'd been the reliable one, the fix-it person, the one who'd sacrifice her own healing to make sure everyone else stayed comfortable. But sitting there, watching them condemn me for finally saying no to their endless demands, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I wasn't their daughter or niece or granddaughter. I was their personal ATM, their get-out-of-jail-free card, their emotional dumping ground. And the moment I'd stopped functioning in that role, they'd decided I had no value at all. The turkey was getting cold on their plates, but nobody seemed to notice. The football game was still playing on the TV in the living room, but the sound felt muted, distant. Everything in this house that had once felt like home now felt foreign, like I was looking at a stage set rather than the place where I'd grown up. My brother David, who'd been suspiciously quiet during the whole confrontation, finally spoke up. "Sarah, maybe you should just apologize. Make this right. You know Tyler's been struggling since his divorce, and the money you refused to lend him could have really helped him get back on his feet. The money. $25,000 that Tyler wanted to borrow for another one of his get-rich-quick schemes. Money I'd earned lying in hospital beds, going through physical therapy, fighting insurance companies, for my disability benefits. Money I'd saved by living in a studio apartment and eating ramen noodles while my body slowly healed from injuries I'd gotten serving the country that these same family members claimed to support with their flag pins and yellow ribbon magnets. Looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd raised me, who'd been present for every major milestone in my life until I'd shipped out for basic training. The grandmother who'd taught me how to bake her famous apple pie. The uncle who'd walked me down the aisle at my wedding before my ex-husband decided military wives were too much trouble. The mother who'd cried when I left for Afghanistan and then seemed to forget I existed when I came back different, damaged, struggling. They wanted me gone? Fine. I'd spent 2 tours in a war zone fighting for people who'd never appreciate the sacrifice. I could handle being thrown out by people who shared my DNA, but apparently none of my values. But they had no idea what they were about to lose. They thought they were punishing me, teaching me a lesson about family loyalty and knowing my place. They had no clue that their comfortable little world, the one they'd built on my silent support and invisible contributions, was about to collapse around them. Because I had a secret, one that would change everything they thought they knew about, who had the power in this family. And they were about to find out exactly what happens when you bite the hand that's been feeding you. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. The moment when their true colors would finally show, when the mask would slip completely off their faces. That moment had arrived sooner than I'd expected, but I was ready. They wanted to play games? Fine. But they'd forgotten one crucial detail about their quiet, damaged, disappointing veteran daughter. I'd been trained to win wars. The silence that followed my laughter felt like the moments after an explosion, when your ears are ringing and you're not sure if you're still alive. I stood there in my grandmother's dining room, surrounded by the wreckage of what I'd thought was my family, and tried to process what had just happened. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking seconds. That felt like hours. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was the same tremor I'd developed after my convoy hit that IED outside Kabul, the one that showed up whenever my nervous system couldn't quite catch up with reality. The therapist at the VA had called it a trauma response, but standing there, looking at these people who shared my blood, I realized trauma came in many forms. Some explosions happened on dusty roads halfway around the world. Others happened in suburban dining rooms on national holidays. Marcus was still standing, his finger pointed at me like a weapon, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Are you going to leave? Or do I need to call the police?" His voice carried the authority he'd always wielded in this family, the unquestioned power of the oldest son, the successful businessman who'd never left the county where he was born. I blinked slowly, trying to reconcile this stranger with the uncle who'd taught me how to throw a curveball in the backyard when I was 12. The same man who'd hugged me tight before I left for boot camp and whispered that he was proud of me. Now he was looking at me like I was something he'd scrape off his shoe. "Police?" I repeated, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "For what exactly?" "For trespassing," Patricia chimed in, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You're not welcome here anymore, Sarah. We've made that clear." The absurdity of it almost made me laugh again. Trespassing. In the house where I'd spent every holiday for the past 28 years. Where I'd helped wallpaper the kitchen when I was 16. Where I'd slept in the guest room during my medical leave, trying to put myself back together while everyone tiptoed around me like I was a live grenade. My mother finally looked up from her plate, her eyes red-rimmed, but her voice steady. "Maybe it's for the best, sweetheart. You need time to think about what family really means, about priorities. The endearment felt like salt in an open wound. She hadn't called me sweetheart since before my first deployment, when I was still the daughter she recognized instead of the broken soldier who'd come home. Time to think about priorities. I almost wanted to tell her about my priorities during those 18 months overseas. How I'd prioritized staying alive so I could come home to them. How I'd prioritized sending half my combat pay back to help with my grandfather's medical bills. How I'd prioritized their comfort over my own healing, their financial stability over my mental health. But explaining would require them to listen, and it was becoming clear that they'd stopped hearing me years ago. Jennifer was back to filming, her phone held at the perfect angle to catch my humiliation. "This is wild," she whispered to her sister Amy, who was nodding along like she was watching a particularly entertaining episode of a reality show. My pain, my confusion, my family's betrayal. It was all just content for their social media feeds. I looked around the table at the faces I'd memorized during childhood, trying to find some trace of the people I'd loved enough to fight a war for. My grandfather sat hunched over his mashed potatoes, looking older than his 82 years. He'd been a Korean War veteran himself, and I'd thought that shared experience would create some kind of bond between us. But he wouldn't meet my eyes, wouldn't acknowledge that his granddaughter was being cast out like a stranger. Tyler, the golden boy whose gambling debts had triggered this whole confrontation, was smirking behind his napkin. He'd always been the favorite, the charming one who could talk his way out of any trouble. While I was learning how to field strip weapons and navigate hostile territory, he was perfecting the art of manipulation, figuring out exactly which buttons to push to get what he wanted from everyone around him. "You know what your problem is, Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "You think your military service makes you special, like the world owes you something because you chose to play soldier for a few years." The words hit like shrapnel, small and sharp and designed to wound. Play soldier, as if the scars on my back from the blast that nearly killed me were just props in some elaborate game. As if the nightmares that still woke me up weren't real. As if the friends I'd lost over there were just characters in a story I'd made up. For attention. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a familiar numbness that had gotten me through the worst moments overseas. It was the same detachment I'd learned when the medics were working on Rodriguez after the sniper got him, when I had to keep functioning despite watching my friend bleed out in the sand. The ability to shut down emotion and operate on pure logic, pure survival instinct. "Is that what you all think?" I asked quietly, looking around the table. That I was playing soldier? The lack of response was answer enough. These people who'd never heard gunfire or seen what an improvised explosive device could do to a human body had decided that my service didn't matter, that the sacrifices I'd made, the parts of myself I'd left buried in Afghan soil, were somehow less real than Tyler's divorce or Patricia's mortgage problems. My brother David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and for a moment I thought he might speak up for me. We'd been close once, before I'd enlisted, before I'd changed into someone he didn't recognize. But he just looked down at his plate and cut another piece of turkey, choosing the safe path of neutral silence. The smell of the dinner was making me nauseous now. The combination of sage and butter that had once meant comfort and belonging now twisted into something sickening. Everything about this scene felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. The sister who'd grown up in this house, who'd believed these people would always have her back, felt like a different person entirely. My phone buzzed in. My pocket, probably a text from one of my army buddies wishing me a happy Thanksgiving. People who actually understood what service meant, who'd stood beside me in the worst moments of our lives, who'd never questioned whether my trauma was real or my sacrifices were valid. The contrast was stark and painful. The family that was supposed to love me unconditionally was throwing me away like garbage, while the family I'd chosen, forged in fire and blood and shared suffering, would always welcome me home. I pulled the manila envelope from my purse and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of the papers inside. Soon, very soon, they would understand exactly what they were losing. But first, I needed to let this moment burn itself into my memory, to remember exactly how it felt to be disposable in the eyes of the people who'd raised me. Because once I opened this envelope, everything would change, and there would be no going back. Growing up in the Henderson family meant understanding your place in the hierarchy from the moment you could walk. Tyler was the crown prince, 18 months older than me, and blessed with the kind of easy charm that made adults melt and forgive any transgression. I was the afterthought, the daughter who came along when they weren't planning for another child, the one who had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. The pattern started early and never wavered. When Tyler broke Mom's favorite vase, at age 6, it was an accident that boys will be boys. What can you do? When I accidentally spilled juice on the carpet that same year, I spent an hour scrubbing stains while listening to a lecture about being more careful and considerate. Tyler's messes were endearing mishaps. Mine were character flaws that needed correction. School brought more of the same. Tyler struggled with reading, so Mom spent hours with him every night, turning homework into games and celebrating every small victory. When I brought home straight A's quarter after quarter, the response was always the same. Well, that's what we expect from you, Sarah. School has always been easy for you. As if my grades materialized through luck rather than the hours I spent studying in my room while Tyler got help with subjects that challenged him. The double standard became more obvious as we entered our teenage years. Tyler could roll in at midnight reeking of beer, and Dad would just shake his head with a knowing smile, muttering something about sowing wild oats. I came home 15 minutes past curfew once, stone sober from a school play rehearsal, and was grounded for 2 weeks. Tyler's rebellion was expected, even admired. Mine was a personal failure that reflected poorly on their parenting. When we both turned 18, the differences became impossible to ignore. Tyler announced he was taking a gap year to find himself, which translated to sleeping until noon and playing video games while I worked 2 part-time jobs to save money for college. Mom would bring him lunch on a tray and speak in hushed tones about how he needed time to figure out his path. Meanwhile, I was expected to have my entire future mapped out with military precision. The irony wasn't lost on me when I actually chose the military. Tyler's aimless wandering was treated like a philosophical journey, while my structured plan to serve my country and earn money for college was met with worried hand-wringing. "Are you sure this is what you want, sweetheart?" Mom had asked, as if joining the army was some impulsive decision rather than the result of months of careful consideration. But they'd supported me, at least on the surface. There were tears at the airport, care packages during basic training, proud Facebook posts about their daughter the soldier. For a brief, shining moment, I thought I'd finally found a way to earn their respect and admiration. I was wrong, but it would take years for me to understand just how wrong. Tyler, meanwhile, discovered entrepreneurship, which in his case meant a series of increasingly elaborate schemes that always required startup capital from the family. First, it was a food truck that never quite got off the ground, despite the $10,000 Dad invested. Then came the cryptocurrency venture that lost $12,000 in 3 months. Each failure was met with sympathy and encouragement to try again. Each time they'd front him more money without question. I watched this from overseas, sending money home whenever I could to help with family expenses, while Tyler burned through their savings on pipe dreams. My combat pay went toward Grandpa's medical bills and Mom's car repairs and a dozen other family emergencies that somehow never qualified Tyler to contribute. He was pursuing his dreams, after all. He couldn't be expected to worry about mundane things like family responsibilities. The real inequality became crystal clear during my first leave home. I'd been in Afghanistan for 8 months, seen things that would haunt me forever, lost friends to roadside bombs and sniper fire. I came back hollow-eyed and jumpy, struggling to readjust to a world where the biggest worry was whether to order pizza or Chinese food for dinner. Tyler had just launched another business venture, something involving dropshipping products from China. He spent dinner regaling everyone with stories about his entrepreneurial journey, his voice animated with excitement about profit margins and market penetration. When someone finally asked about my deployment, I managed a few sentences about the heat and the long hours before Tyler interrupted to explain how his new venture was going to revolutionize online retail. Nobody seemed to notice that I'd barely touched my food or that I jumped every time a car backfired outside. They were too busy hanging on Tyler's every word, asking intelligent questions about his business model, while treating my war stories like uncomfortable interruptions to the real conversation. That night, lying in my childhood bed and staring at glow-in-the-dark stars I'd put on the ceiling in middle school, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I'd left as their daughter and come back as a stranger they didn't know how to relate to. Tyler, who'd never left the state, remained the center of their universe while I'd become a satellite orbiting at an uncomfortable distance. The pattern held through my second deployment and the injuries that ended my active duty service. While I was learning to walk again after the IED blast, Tyler was explaining to anyone who'd listen how his latest business failure was actually a valuable learning experience. While I was fighting insurance companies for my disability benefits, he was pitching Mom and Dad on his next big idea. The family gatherings became exercises in emotional archaeology, digging through layers of resentment to find whatever love might still exist underneath. I'd sit quietly through dinner, listening to detailed updates on Tyler's various projects, while my own struggles with PTSD and chronic pain were dismissed as temporary setbacks that I'd overcome with the right attitude. When Tyler got married, the wedding was a 3-day extravaganza that cost more than I'd earned in my first year of military service. When I got married, it was a small ceremony that they attended with polite smiles and early departures. When Tyler got divorced, 2 years later, it was a tragedy that required the entire family's emotional support and financial assistance. When my marriage fell apart because my ex-husband couldn't handle my nightmares and flashbacks, I was told that I needed to work harder on communication. The hierarchy never changed, no matter what I accomplished or how much I sacrificed. Tyler remained the golden child whose potential was always just around the corner, while I was the reliable workhorse whose achievements were expected rather than celebrated. His failures were learning experiences. Mine were personal shortcomings. So when Tyler's gambling addiction finally surfaced, when the family discovered he owed $25,000 to various creditors and bookies, the response was predictably familiar. It wasn't his fault, not really. He'd been struggling since his divorce, using gambling as an unhealthy coping mechanism. The family needed to rally around him, support him through this difficult time. And naturally, they turned to me to make it happen. The awakening didn't happen all at once. It crept up on me slowly, like the phantom pain from my injured leg that would start as a whisper and build to a scream. For years, I'd accepted the family dynamic as natural law, the way things had always been and always would be. Tyler was the dreamer, the one with potential. I was the steady one, the problem solver, the one who kept her head down and did what needed to be done. It started during my second deployment, in the quiet moments between patrols when I'd get emails from home. Mom would write long updates about Tyler's latest venture, how excited he was about this new opportunity, how much promise it showed. Then, almost as an afterthought, she'd mention that they'd had to take out a second mortgage to help him get started, or that Dad was working overtime to cover the shortfall from Tyler's last business failure. I remember sitting in my bunk in the forward operating base, reading those emails by the glow of my tablet while rockets occasionally whistled overhead, and feeling something shift in my chest. Here I was, risking my life for $2,400 a month, sending half of it home to help with family expenses, while Tyler was burning through tens of thousands of dollars with their blessing and encouragement. The comparison felt wrong, like a math equation that didn't balance. But I pushed the feeling down, told myself that Tyler needed support right now and I was strong enough to provide it without recognition. That's what family did, right? Everyone contributed according to their abilities. But the emails kept coming, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Tyler's failures were always described with sympathy and understanding. The food truck that never opened because of permit issues that turned out to be Tyler never filing the proper paperwork. The cryptocurrency investment that tanked because Tyler had put everything into a coin recommended by a guy he met at a bar. The online store that failed because Tyler couldn't be bothered to actually ship the products people ordered. Each disaster was framed as a learning experience, a stepping stone toward eventual success. Meanwhile, my steady progress through the ranks, my successful completion of specialized training programs, my commendations for performance under fire were mentioned briefly, if at all. Tyler's potential was endlessly fascinating to them. My actual achievements were simply expected. The real awakening came during my medical leave after the blast. I was staying in my childhood bedroom, spending most days in physical therapy or at the VA hospital, trying to piece together a future that didn't involve the military career that had defined me for 6 years. My leg was healing slowly, and the headaches from my concussion made it hard to concentrate on anything for long periods. Tyler was living at home too, having moved back after his divorce, and the contrast in how we were treated became stark and undeniable. I'd drag myself home from therapy sessions exhausted and hurting, and Mom would ask if I was okay before immediately launching into concerns about Tyler's emotional state. He was having such a hard time adjusting to single life, she'd say. The divorce had been so difficult for him. He needed space to heal. Meanwhile, Tyler would sleep until noon, spend afternoons playing video games or meeting friends for drinks, and come home for dinner expecting to be waited on like a guest at a hotel. When I suggested that maybe he could help with household chores or start looking for a job, Mom would pull me aside and explain that I needed to be more understanding. He was processing trauma, she said, apparently unaware that I might be dealing with some trauma of my own. The breaking point came one evening when I was struggling to carry groceries from the car with my cane and healing leg. Tyler was sitting on the porch smoking a cigarette, watching me struggle with the bags. When I asked if he could help, he said he was taking a mental health break and couldn't handle any stress right now. Mom, who witnessed the whole exchange, sided with him. "Sarah, you know your brother is going through a difficult time," she said, taking the groceries from me with a martyred sigh. "Can't you be more supportive?" That night, lying in my bed and listening to Tyler's loud phone conversations about his plans to start a landscaping business with money he didn't have, I felt something crystallize in my mind. This wasn't about Tyler having a hard time or needing family support. This was about a fundamental difference in how the family viewed our respective worth and potential. Tyler's needs were seen as legitimate and urgent. Mine were inconveniences to be managed. His dreams were investments worth making. My stability was a resource to be exploited. His failures were temporary setbacks. My struggles were character flaws to be overcome through willpower. I started paying closer attention to family dynamics, treating it like reconnaissance work. At dinner, I'd count how many minutes each conversation topic lasted. Tyler's job search, his therapy sessions, his dating life, his various business ideas would dominate entire meals. My physical therapy progress, my job applications, my nightmares about combat might get 2 or 3 minutes before someone would change the subject back to Tyler. When relatives called, they'd ask about Tyler first, last, and often exclusively. How's Tyler handling the divorce? Is Tyler getting back on his feet? What's Tyler's next plan? I became an afterthought, the reliable daughter who didn't need checking on because she always figured things out on her own. The pattern extended beyond my immediate family. At holiday gatherings, aunts and uncles would gather around Tyler, offering advice and encouragement for his latest scheme. They'd nod along as he explained his vision for success, their eyes bright with vicarious excitement. When I mentioned my plans to use my GI benefits for college or talked about potential career paths, I'd get polite nods and quick subject changes. Uncle Marcus was particularly transparent about the hierarchy. "Tyler's got that entrepreneurial spirit," he'd say, clapping my cousin on the back. "He's going to make it big one of these days, mark my words." Then he'd turn to me with a patronizing smile. "And Sarah's always been so practical. She'll find something steady, I'm sure. Steady, practical, reliable." These became the words that defined me in their eyes, and I began to understand that they weren't really compliments. They were ways of diminishing my ambitions and achievements, of keeping me in the supporting role while Tyler played the star. The realization was painful, but also oddly liberating. For the first time, I could see the family dynamics clearly, without the fog of childhood conditioning and desperate need for approval. I wasn't imagining the favoritism or being overly sensitive about unfair treatment. There was a systematic devaluation of my contributions and elevation of Tyler's potential that had been operating for decades. I started documenting it, almost without realizing it. Mental notes about who got asked first about their day, whose problems received the most attention, whose achievements were celebrated, and whose were minimized. The data was overwhelming and consistent. Tyler was the sun around which the family orbit revolved. I was a distant planet, occasionally visible but never the center of attention. The hardest part was accepting that this wasn't something that would change if I just performed better or contributed more. I'd spent years trying to earn their recognition. Through perfect grades, military service, financial support, and emotional availability. None of it had shifted the fundamental dynamic. Tyler remained the favored child regardless of his failures, and I remained the afterthought regardless of my successes. Understanding this didn't make it hurt less, but it did make it make sense. And for the first time in my life, I began to consider what it might mean to stop playing by their rules. The manipulation never announced itself with fanfare. It didn't arrive wearing a villain's costume or carrying a sign that said, "Emotional blackmail in progress." Instead, it came wrapped in the language of love, duty, and family loyalty, delivered by people who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. That's what made it so insidious, so effective, and so hard to recognize until I was already drowning in it. It started with phrases that sounded reasonable, even loving. "Sarah, you've always been so capable," Mom would say when another crisis hit the family finances. "We know we can count on you to help us figure this out." The words felt warm, like recognition of my competence and reliability. It took me years to understand that being capable in their vocabulary meant being the designated fixer, the one whose own needs could be set aside because she was strong enough to handle it. "Family comes first" was another favorite, trotted out whenever I hesitated to drain my savings account or cancel my own plans to deal with someone else's emergency. The phrase carried the weight of moral authority, making any resistance feel selfish and cruel. How could I argue with putting family first? What kind of person would prioritize her own needs over the family's well-being? The beauty of this particular manipulation was how it reframed my boundaries as character defects. When I suggested that Tyler should get a job instead of pursuing another doomed business venture, I wasn't being practical or financially responsible. I was being unsupportive of his dreams. When I mentioned that I needed to save money for my own future, I wasn't being prudent. I was being selfish and forgetting where I came from. Uncle Marcus was particularly skilled at this technique. He'd lean back in his chair during family gatherings, stroking his beard with the authority of the family patriarch, and deliver pronouncements that sounded like wisdom but functioned like chains. "The thing about family, Sarah," he'd say, "is that we lift each other up. When one of us succeeds, we all succeed. When one of us struggles, we all pitch in. That's what separates us from ordinary people." The implication was clear. Questioning this philosophy meant rejecting the family itself. Wanting to keep my own money meant abandoning the values that made us special. Setting boundaries meant breaking the sacred bonds that held us together. The manipulation was brilliant because it made me complicit in my own exploitation, convincing me that giving until it hurt was actually a privilege, a sign of my superior character. Guilt was their most powerful weapon, deployed with surgical precision whenever I showed signs of resistance. When I balked at co-signing yet another loan for Tyler, Dad would get that wounded look in his eyes, the one that said I'd personally broken his heart. "I thought we raised you better than this," he'd say quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Your brother made some mistakes, but that's when family is supposed to step up, not step away." The guilt was especially effective because it was mixed with just enough truth to make it stick. Tyler was struggling. The family did need help. I did have more financial stability than most of them. These facts made it almost impossible to see how they were being weaponized against me, turned into clubs to beat down any resistance to their demands. Mom preferred the tearful approach, her eyes filling with water whenever I expressed hesitation about their latest request for help. "I don't know what we're going to do," she'd whisper, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I've been losing sleep over this, Sarah. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof. We're all so worried about Tyler, and now you're saying you won't help? I just don't understand how you can sleep at night knowing your brother might lose everything." Sleep at night. As if my insomnia wasn't already legendary in the family. As if the nightmares from my deployment weren't still waking me up in cold sweats 3 times a week. But my trauma was invisible, manageable, something I was expected to handle quietly on my own. Tyler's drama was a family emergency requiring all hands on deck. The manipulation extended beyond direct requests for money. They'd engineer situations where my help would seem inevitable, where refusing would require me to actively hurt someone I cared about. Grandpa's medications were expensive, and the insurance wasn't covering everything. Could I help with the copays? Mom's car needed repairs she couldn't afford, and she had to drive to work every day. Could I cover the cost so she wouldn't lose her job? These weren't technically requests for Tyler, but somehow Tyler always benefited. The money that went to Grandpa's medications meant Mom and Dad didn't have to choose between helping their father and enabling their son. The car repair fund freed up money they could spend on Tyler's latest venture. I was unknowingly subsidizing his lifestyle while being told I was helping with legitimate family needs. They'd also use my military service against me, twisting my sense of duty and honor into another form of control. "You served your country? So bravely," Patricia would say, her voice thick with artificial pride. "You understand what sacrifice means better than anyone. That's why we know you'll do the right thing for your family." The implication was that refusing to bankroll Tyler's mistakes would somehow dishonor my service, that a real soldier would never abandon her fellow troops. The most insidious manipulation was how they made me feel grateful for the opportunity to help. "We're so lucky to have you, Sarah," Mom would say after I'd transferred another chunk of my savings to cover one of Tyler's debts. "Not every family has someone as generous and responsible as you. We don't know what we'd do without you. Lucky to have me." As if my value to the family was measured entirely by my willingness to solve their problems and fund their mistakes. As if my worth as a daughter, sister, and human being was directly proportional to the size of my bank account and my willingness to empty it for their benefit. They'd remind me constantly of how much they'd sacrificed for me growing up, conveniently, forgetting that raising your children is a basic parental responsibility, not a loan to be repaid with interest for the rest of your life. "We gave you everything when you were young," Dad would say. "Now it's your turn to give back." The mathematics of family love, where every childhood Christmas present and school supply created a debt that could never be fully repaid. The manipulation was so thorough, so embedded in the fabric of our family culture, that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. This was just how families worked, wasn't it? The strong helped the weak, the successful supported the struggling, the reliable cleaned up after the irresponsible. Any other arrangement would be cold, selfish, un-American. It took years of therapy and distance to understand that healthy families don't operate like emotional pyramid schemes, with one person at the bottom supporting everyone else's weight. Real love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Genuine family bonds don't need to be maintained through guilt, obligation, and financial transactions. But by the time I figured that out, I'd already been trapped in their system for decades, trained to see my own needs as selfish and their demands as reasonable. Breaking free would require more than just understanding the manipulation. It would require finding the courage to disappoint people I loved, even when they made me feel like disappointing them meant destroying the family itself. The demands started, small, almost reasonable, like ripples in a pond that gradually build into waves capable of drowning you. During my first deployment, it was $50 here and there for gas money or groceries. Just until Dad's next paycheck, Mom would explain in her emails, her digital voice tinged with embarrassment. Things are a little tight this month. I'd send the money without question, proud to help my family while I was serving overseas. When I came home on leave that first time, I discovered that a little tight had been a massive understatement. Dad had been laid off from his factory job 6 months earlier and was struggling to find work that paid anywhere near his previous salary. Mom's part-time job at the grocery store barely covered utilities. Meanwhile, Tyler had convinced them to invest $8,000 in his food truck dream, money they'd borrowed against the house. "It's going to pay off," Tyler insisted over dinner, his eyes bright with the fervor of a true believer. "The profit margins on specialty tacos are incredible. I've got it all figured out." When I asked to see his business plan, he waved me off with talk about market research and demographic analysis that sounded impressive but meant nothing. The food truck never materialized, but the debt remained. That's when they started looking to me more seriously as a financial resource. Not as a loan, they were careful to emphasize, but as an investment in the family's future. "When Tyler's business takes off," Dad explained, "he'll pay everyone back with interest. We're all going to benefit from supporting him now." The language was important. I wasn't being asked to bail out my brother's failed venture. I was being invited to participate in a family investment opportunity. I sent $3,000 from my deployment savings, money I'd planned to use for college when I got out of the service. It felt like the right thing to do, the loyal thing to do. Tyler was family, and families supported each other through tough times. Besides, I was single, living on base, with minimal expenses. I could afford to help in ways that others couldn't. The second deployment brought bigger requests and more creative justifications. Tyler's food truck idea had evolved into a catering business, which required commercial kitchen equipment and a van for deliveries. The startup costs were substantial, but the potential returns were enormous. "He's learned from his mistakes," Mom assured me during our monthly phone calls. "This time he's really thought everything through." I watched my savings account shrink by another $5,000, then $7,000 more when the van broke down and needed a new transmission. Each transfer was accompanied by detailed explanations of why this particular expense was crucial to Tyler's success, why this investment would be the one that finally paid off. The catering business lasted 8 months before Tyler lost interest and moved on to selling imported jewelry online. By my 3rd year in the service, the requests had evolved into expectations. There was no longer any pretense that I was being asked to help. Family emergencies simply appeared in my inbox with the assumption that I would handle them. Grandpa's prescription costs, Mom's dental work, the water heater that died in the middle of winter. Each crisis came with detailed explanations of why they couldn't possibly cover the costs themselves and grateful acknowledgments of my generosity in stepping up once again. Tyler's ventures continued to multiply and fail with predictable regularity. The jewelry business became a fitness supplement pyramid scheme, which became a cryptocurrency trading operation, which became a house-flipping enterprise that never actually flipped any houses. Each transition required fresh capital, and each failure was met with understanding rather than accountability. "He's an entrepreneur," Uncle Marcus would explain to anyone who questioned Tyler's track record. "Entrepreneurs fail multiple times before they succeed. Look at all the famous businessmen who went bankrupt before they made it big." The family had adopted Tyler's narrative wholesale, seeing his consistent failures as evidence of his eventual success rather than a pattern of poor judgment and planning. Meanwhile, my own financial needs were treated as temporary inconveniences that I should be able to handle independently. When I mentioned wanting to buy a reliable car to replace my aging Honda, Mom suggested I look at used vehicles since I didn't need anything fancy. When Tyler decided he needed a new truck for his contracting business that existed only in his imagination, Dad co-signed a loan for a $40,000 pickup that Tyler defaulted on within 6 months. The double standard became a source of constant frustration, but voicing that frustration made me seem petty and jealous. "Sarah's always been practical," Patricia would say when I suggested that maybe Tyler should get a regular job before pursuing another business venture. "She doesn't understand the entrepreneurial mindset." As if my reluctance to fund his fantasies was a character flaw rather than basic financial sense. The breaking point should have come when Tyler's gambling addiction surfaced, but instead, it marked an escalation in both his needs and the family's willingness to enable him. What started as occasional poker games with friends had evolved into regular casino visits, online betting accounts, and increasingly desperate attempts to win back his losses. The family discovered the extent of the problem when creditors started calling the house, demanding payment on debts Tyler had accumulated using Dad's name as a reference. $25,000. That was the number that finally shattered my willingness to keep throwing money into the black hole of Tyler's irresponsibility. Not the total amount he owed, which was probably much higher, but the amount the family expected me to contribute toward paying off his gambling debts. "It's an addiction," Mom explained tearfully. "He needs help, not judgment. The therapist says family support is crucial for his recovery." Family support. The phrase had become meaningless through overuse, a catch-all justification for any unreasonable request. Tyler needed family support to start his businesses, to keep them running, to transition to new ventures when the old ones failed, and now to clean up the mess left by his gambling addiction. The support only flowed in one direction, from my bank account to his creditors, with no expectation that he would ever reciprocate or even acknowledge the sacrifices being made on his behalf. The requests had grown from $50 gas money to demands that I liquidate my entire savings account to cover gambling debts. The timeline had compressed from gentle monthly asks to urgent demands for immediate transfers to prevent catastrophic consequences. The stakes had escalated from helping with temporary cash flow problems to preventing financial ruin for the entire extended family. But the pattern remained exactly the same. Tyler's problems became family emergencies that required my money to solve. His poor choices became external circumstances beyond his control that demanded collective sacrifice. His addiction became a medical condition that required financial treatment from everyone except the person actually suffering from it. The crescendo of escalating demands had finally reached a volume I couldn't ignore. For years I'd been turning up my own music to drown out the sound, convincing myself that the increasing requests were just temporary adjustments, that things would return to normal once Tyler got back on his feet. But there was no normal to return to. There had never been a time when Tyler was financially stable or emotionally mature enough to handle his own problems. The $25,000 demand wasn't an emergency. It was the natural evolution of a system that had been building toward this moment for years. And my refusal to pay it wasn't the cruel abandonment of a struggling family member. It was the first time I'd ever drawn a line in the sand and said no to their endless hunger for my resources. The text message arrived on a Tuesday evening in October, just as I was settling into my apartment after a long day of physical therapy and job interviews. I'd been out of the Army for 8 months, still adjusting to civilian life, still fighting the VA for proper disability benefits, still trying to figure out who I was without a uniform and a mission. My phone buzzed against the coffee table, and I saw Mom's name on the screen. "We need to talk. Family emergency. Call me ASAP." My stomach dropped the way it always did when those words appeared. Family emergency had become code for Tyler's latest disaster, and I was tired of being the designated cleanup crew. But family was family, so I called. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice shaky with barely controlled panic. "Sarah, thank God. We need your help. Tyler's in real trouble this time." Real trouble. As opposed to the fake trouble of his previous business failures, relationship disasters, and financial collapses. I rubbed my forehead, feeling the familiar tension headache building behind my eyes. "What happened?" "He owes money. A lot of money. To some very serious people." Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if saying it too loudly might make it more real. $25,000, Sarah. They're threatening him. They know where he lives, where we live. They called the house yesterday and said if he doesn't pay by the end of the month, they're going to make him sorry. $25,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. That wasn't credit card, debt, or a failed business loan. That was serious money, the kind that came with serious consequences. How did he rack up $25,000 in gambling debts? "It started small," Mom said, her words tumbling over each other in her rush to explain. "Just poker with friends, you know? But then he discovered online betting, and there were these apps on his phone, and he thought he could win it back. But it just kept getting worse. He's been hiding it from us for months, Sarah. We had no idea how bad it had gotten until these men called." I closed my eyes, seeing the pattern as clearly as a road map I'd traveled too many times before. Tyler gets in over his head. Tyler hides the problem until it becomes a crisis. Tyler confesses to the family. The family rallies to fix Tyler's mess. Rinse and repeat, with the numbers getting bigger each time. "What does Tyler say about all this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He's devastated. Absolutely devastated. He knows he made mistakes, but he's committed to getting help. He's already started going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings, and he's found a therapist who specializes in addiction. But none of that matters if these people hurt him, Sarah. We have to pay them off first, then worry about treatment." Treatment. That would undoubtedly require more money, more family support, more sacrifices from everyone except the person who'd created the problem in the first place. I'd heard this song before, knew all the words by heart. "Have you considered calling the police?" I asked. "If these people are threatening Tyler, that's illegal. Maybe—" "We can't involve the police," Mom interrupted, her voice sharp with fear. "Tyler owes this money legitimately. He placed the bets, he lost, he owes the debt. And these aren't the kind of people who care about legal technicalities. They have ways of collecting that don't show up on police reports." The implication hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. Tyler had gotten involved with loan sharks, professional criminals who viewed broken legs as a reasonable collection strategy. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about physical safety, about preventing Tyler from becoming a statistic in someone else's crime report. "How much can the family contribute?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer to that too. "We're tapped out, sweetheart. Dad's still looking for steady work, and what I make at the store barely covers our bills. Marcus and Patricia are dealing with Patricia's medical expenses from her surgery last month. David's got the new baby, and Jennifer's still paying off her student loans. We've all contributed what we can, but it's not enough. We're about 12,000 short. 12,000 short. Which meant they expected me to cover the difference, plus probably a buffer for Tyler's living expenses while he got his life together. Again. The math was as predictable as gravity. "Sarah, I know it's a lot to ask," Mom continued, her voice taking on that pleading tone I'd learned to dread. "But you're the only one who has that kind of money available. Your military savings, your disability payments, that nest egg you've been building. We wouldn't ask if we had any other choice." That nest egg. 2 years of careful saving, of living in a studio apartment and eating ramen noodles and driving a car held together with prayer and duct tape. Money I'd earmarked for. A down payment on a house. For the stability and security I'd never had growing up. Money that represented my future, my independence, my chance to build something lasting for myself. "This is different from his other problems," Mom pressed on, sensing my hesitation. "This isn't about a failed business or bad investments. This is about Tyler's safety, maybe even his life. These people don't care that he's sorry or that he's getting help. They just want their money, and they want it now. Life or death. The ultimate manipulation, the nuclear option in the family guilt arsenal. How could I weigh my dreams of home ownership against Tyler's physical safety? What kind of sister would choose financial security over her brother's well-being? But even as the familiar guilt washed over me, something else was stirring in my chest. A cold, hard knot of anger that had been building for years, fed by every crisis I'd solved and every sacrifice I'd made that went unacknowledged and unappreciated. Tyler's gambling addiction was serious, but it was also entirely self-inflicted. He'd made every single choice that led to this moment, from the first bet to the last desperate attempt to win back his losses. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Time?" Mom's voice rose an octave. "Sarah, we don't have time. These people gave Tyler until the end of the month, and that's less than 2 weeks away. Every day we wait makes the situation more dangerous." "I understand the urgency, Mom. But $25,000 is my entire savings account. It's everything I've worked for since leaving the Army. I can't just write a check without thinking it through." The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval and disbelief. In the Henderson family hierarchy, thinking things through was code for being selfish, for putting your own interests ahead of family needs. Good daughters, loyal sisters, didn't need time to consider whether to save their brother from violent criminals. "I thought you'd grown out of this phase," Mom said finally, her voice cold with disappointment. "This selfishness, this putting money ahead of family. Tyler could be seriously hurt, Sarah. How would you live with yourself if something happened to him because you were worried about your bank account?" There it was, the final card in their deck, the accusation that my reluctance to bankroll Tyler's latest disaster made me responsible for whatever consequences followed. Not Tyler, who'd placed the bets. Not the family, who'd enabled his irresponsible behavior for decades. Me, for failing to sacrifice my future to clean up his mess. "I'll call you back tomorrow," I said, and hung up before she could launch into another guilt spiral. I sat in my apartment that night, staring at my laptop screen and the online banking page that showed my account balance. $23,417. 2 years of disciplined saving, of choosing generic groceries over name brands, of driving with a broken air conditioner rather than spending money on repairs. Every dollar represented a choice, a sacrifice, a step toward the independence I'd dreamed of since childhood. But it also represented Tyler's safety, according to my family. The difference between my brother walking away from his gambling debts and potentially ending up in a hospital or worse. $23,000 to save Tyler's life seemed like a reasonable exchange, even if it meant starting over from zero again. The internal battle raged for hours. Duty versus self-preservation. Family loyalty versus personal boundaries. The sister who'd been trained to fix everyone's problems versus the woman who was finally learning to value her own dreams and needs. By morning, I'd made my decision. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to say no to a family crisis. Tyler's gambling debts were Tyler's responsibility, and the consequences of his choices were his to face. I'd spent too many years cleaning up his messes, only to watch him create new ones because he never faced real accountability for his actions. The word felt foreign in my mouth when I called Mom back, like speaking a language I'd never learned properly. No, I'm not giving Tyler money for his gambling debts. The explosion of outrage and disbelief that followed confirmed what I'd suspected for years. I wasn't their daughter. I was their emergency fund, their backup plan, their get-out-of-jail-free card. And the moment I stopped functioning in that role, I became the enemy. The word no hung in the air between me and my mother like a live grenade with the pin pulled. For a moment, neither of us breathed. I could hear the clock ticking in my apartment, the distant hum of traffic outside, the sound of my own heartbeat, drumming in my ears. It was such a small word, 2 letters, 1 syllable, but it carried the weight of 28 years of conditioning, expectation, and family mythology. "What did you just say?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper, as if she couldn't quite process what she'd heard. I said no. The word came easier the second time, like a muscle that was finally remembering how to work. "I'm not giving Tyler money for his gambling debts." The silence that followed was different from the first one. This wasn't shock or disbelief. This was the calm before the storm, the moment when a person's entire worldview shifts and they're trying to figure out which way is up. I'd broken a fundamental rule of family physics, challenged a law that had governed our relationships for as long as anyone could remember. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson. Mom's voice was shaking now, but not with fear or sadness. With rage. Pure, undiluted rage. "Your brother's life is in danger and you're worried about money? What has happened to you? This isn't the daughter I raised. The daughter you raised." The phrase stung because it was true in ways she didn't intend. The daughter she'd raised would have emptied her bank account without question, would have taken out loans she couldn't afford, would have sold her possessions to make sure Tyler was safe. The daughter she'd raised had been conditioned to believe that her own needs were secondary to everyone else's emergencies. The daughter you raised spent her entire adult life fixing everyone else's problems, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. She sent half her combat pay home while living in a war zone. She paid for Grandpa's medications while eating ramen noodles for dinner. She bailed Tyler out of 6 different business failures without ever asking for a thank you. Maybe it's time. That daughter started taking care of herself. "This is different," Mom's voice cracked with desperation. "This isn't about business failures or medical bills. Tyler could be hurt. These people don't care about his good intentions or his promises to do better. They want their money, and if they don't get it, they'll take it out of his hide." The emotional manipulation was so familiar I could have written the script myself. Escalate the stakes until refusing becomes impossible. Make the consequences so dire that any reasonable person would cave under the pressure. Paint Tyler as the victim of circumstances beyond his control rather than the architect of his own disaster. Then maybe Tyler should have thought about that before he gambled away $25,000, I said. Maybe he should have considered the consequences before he got involved with loan sharks. Maybe, for once in his life, he should face the results of his own choices. "How can you be so cold?" Mom was crying now, her words coming between ragged sobs. "This is your brother we're talking about. Your own flesh and blood. We're supposed to protect each other, support each other. That's what family means." Family means. The phrase that had been used to justify every unreasonable request, every boundary violation, every demand that I sacrifice my own well-being for someone else's convenience. Family means you don't ask questions when someone needs help. Family means you give until it hurts and then give some more. Family means one person's crisis becomes everyone's emergency, except the responsibility for solving it always fell to the same person. Family also means Tyler shouldn't have lied to all of us for months about his gambling problem, I replied. Family means he shouldn't have racked up debts he couldn't pay. Family means he should get a job and work out a payment plan instead of expecting his sister to liquidate her life savings to clean up his mess. A payment plan? Mom's voice rose to a near shriek. Sarah, these aren't credit card companies we're dealing with. These are dangerous people. They don't offer payment plans or negotiate terms. They break legs and burn down houses. Do you understand what you're condemning your brother to? I understood perfectly. Tyler had gotten involved with criminals, and now he was facing criminal consequences. The logical response would be to contact law enforcement to get professional help dealing with people who operated outside the law. But that would require admitting that Tyler's problems were serious enough to warrant official intervention. And it would mean facing the possibility that there might be consequences the family couldn't simply throw money at to make disappear. Have you talked to Tyler about this? I asked. About how he plans to handle the situation? Tyler's barely functioning, Mom said, her voice thick with tears. He's terrified, Sarah. He's been staying at different friends' houses because he's afraid to come home. He's not eating, barely sleeping. The guilt is eating him alive, and now his own sister is abandoning him when he needs her most. Abandoning him. The word was chosen carefully, designed to make me feel like the villain in this story, not Tyler, who'd created the crisis through his own irresponsible choices, not the family, who'd enabled his destructive behavior for years, me, for finally refusing to be the designated cleanup crew for disasters I hadn't caused. I'm not abandoning Tyler, I said, though part of me wondered if that was true. I'm refusing to enable him anymore. There's a difference. Enabling? Mom's voice was shrill with disbelief. You call helping your brother stay alive enabling? You call family support enabling? What kind of person have you become, Sarah? The military really did change you, didn't it? Turned you hard and selfish and cold. The military really did change you. Another carefully chosen phrase, designed to make my service seem like a character flaw rather than something to be proud of. The implication was clear. The daughter who'd left for basic training would have given Tyler the money without question. The damaged woman who'd come back from Afghanistan was too broken to understand what family loyalty meant. Yes, the military changed me, I said, my voice gaining strength. It taught me about accountability. It taught me that actions have consequences. It taught me that you can't solve problems by throwing money at them if you're not willing to address the root cause. Maybe if Tyler had learned those lessons, he wouldn't be in this situation. I can't believe what I'm hearing, Mom whispered. Your own brother, Sarah, your own family. We supported you through everything. Your deployment, your injuries, your struggles coming home. We never gave up on you, even when you were difficult and angry and impossible to reach. And now, when we need your help, you turn your back on us. They never gave up on me. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd supported me by ignoring my PTSD symptoms and telling me to get over it. They'd helped me through my struggles by changing the subject whenever I tried to talk about my experiences. Overseas. They'd been there for me by treating my combat pay like a family resource and my disability benefits like a personal slush fund. I'm not turning my back on the family, I said. I'm setting a boundary. I'm saying that Tyler's gambling addiction is Tyler's problem to solve, not mine. I'm saying that I won't sacrifice my entire future to enable his destructive behavior. One more time. Boundary. Mom spat the word like it tasted bitter. Is that what your therapist taught you? To use psychology words to justify being selfish? We're not talking about setting boundaries, Sarah. We're talking about saving your brother's life. My therapist. Another weapon in her arsenal, turning my attempts to heal from combat trauma into evidence of my moral deficiency. The fact that I was getting professional help for my PTSD wasn't something to be proud of. It was proof that I'd been corrupted by outside influences, that I'd let strangers poison my mind against my own family. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Mom cycling through every manipulation technique in the family playbook: guilt, fear, obligation, historical revisionism, personal attacks. She deployed them all with the skill of someone who'd been practicing for decades. But for the first time in my adult life, none of them worked. I'd finally found something stronger than my need for their approval, my need for self-respect. I hung up the phone feeling lighter than I had in years, as if I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there until I finally set it down. The phone started ringing again immediately, but I didn't answer. Then came the text messages, each one more desperate and accusatory than the last. Then my email inbox started filling up with messages from various family members, all expressing their shock and disappointment at my selfishness. But I didn't respond to any of them. For the first time in my life, I'd drawn a line in the sand and meant it. The consequences would come soon enough. I had no illusions about how the family would react to being told no. But at least they would be consequences I'd chosen, rather than ones I'd accepted out of guilt and conditioning. The war was about to begin, but for once, I was fighting for myself. What my family didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams, was that their quiet, obedient, financially reliable daughter had been planning her independence for over 3 years. While they saw me as their perpetual safety net, their emergency fund with legs, I'd been quietly building something they never thought I was capable of, a life completely separate from their dysfunction. It started during my second deployment, in those long, sleepless nights when mortars would whistle overhead and I'd lie in my bunk thinking about what I wanted my life to look like when I got home. Not if I got home. I couldn't afford that kind of pessimism. But when? I'd picture myself in my own space, surrounded by my own things, answerable to no one but myself. The dream felt impossible then, like something other people got to have while I remained tethered to my family's endless crises. But impossible dreams have a way of becoming plans when you're desperate enough and patient enough to make them real. The first step was opening a bank account they didn't know about. Not the one I used for sending money home or covering family emergencies, but a completely separate account at a different bank, one where I deposited small amounts from each paycheck. $20 here, $50 there, never enough to be missed, but always enough to grow. I called it my emergency fund, though I understood even then that the emergency I was preparing for wasn't medical bills or car repairs. It was freedom. While Tyler was burning through their savings on his various business ventures, I was learning about investments, real estate, specifically. The kind of long-term, boring financial planning that Tyler would never have patience for, but that appealed to my methodical military mindset. I spent hours researching markets, reading about property values, understanding mortgage processes. The other soldiers thought I was planning to flip houses when I got out. They had no idea I was planning to flip my entire life. The house found me rather than the other way around. It was a foreclosure in a neighborhood 40 minutes from where I grew up, far enough to feel like a different world, but close enough that I could still visit family when I chose to, rather than when they demanded it. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since 1987, and a backyard that was more weeds than grass. The listing photos showed water stains on the ceiling and carpet that had seen better decades. It was perfect. The inspection revealed problems that would have scared off most buyers. Outdated electrical work, a roof that needed replacing within 5 years, plumbing that belonged in a museum. But I'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan, living in conditions that would make that house look like a palace. I could handle some cosmetic issues and delayed maintenance. More importantly, the problems drove the price down to something I could actually afford with my VA loan benefits. While my family was pooling their resources to fund Tyler's latest entrepreneurial fantasy, I was quietly negotiating the purchase of my own piece of America. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday in March, 2 weeks before Tyler's gambling. Debts exploded into a family crisis. I took a personal day from my job at the VA hospital, drove to a lawyer's office I'd never seen before, and signed papers that made me a homeowner. Sarah Elizabeth Henderson, sole owner of 1247 Maple Street. The words on the deed looked foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. I'd planned to tell the family eventually, once I'd gotten settled and figured out how to explain why I'd kept such a major purchase secret. I imagined having them over for dinner, showing off the improvements I'd made, demonstrating that their damaged, unreliable daughter was actually capable of building something lasting and beautiful. I thought they'd be proud of me, impressed by my initiative and financial responsibility. I was naive enough to believe they'd see my independence as an achievement rather than a threat. The house needed work, but I had time and motivation in abundance. I spent weekends stripping wallpaper, painting rooms, pulling up carpet to reveal hardwood floors that just needed refinishing. The physical labor was therapeutic in ways that formal therapy couldn't match. Every improvement I made felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been lost somewhere between childhood and combat. I bought furniture slowly, piece by piece, choosing items that reflected my taste rather than family hand-me-downs or military-issued functionality. A couch that was actually comfortable instead of just practical. A dining table where I could eat meals in peace without listening to Tyler's latest scheme or my parents' latest financial crisis. A bed that was mine alone, in a room where no one could burst in uninvited to make demands on my time, money, or emotional energy. The secret felt enormous, heavy with the weight of deception by omission. Every family gathering became an exercise in careful conversation, avoiding topics that might reveal what I'd been up to. When they asked about my living situation, I'd mention my studio apartment truthfully, but incompletely. When they wondered why I seemed more confident lately, more willing to speak up during family discussions, I'd credit therapy and time healing from my deployment trauma. All of which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that owning property had changed something fundamental in how I saw myself and my place in the family dynamic. I wasn't just the reliable daughter anymore, the one whose role was defined entirely by her usefulness to others. I was a homeowner, a property owner, someone with assets and options. Someone who could choose where to live and who to live with, rather than someone who existed at the mercy of other people's decisions. The mortgage payments came out of my secret account automatically each month, money that my family assumed I was saving for some vague future goal. They never asked for specifics about my financial plans, probably because they assumed those plans would eventually involve helping them with their various crises. The idea that I might have goals that didn't include them, dreams that didn't, revolve around their needs, simply didn't occur to them. I'd furnished the house completely and been living there for 6 months before Tyler's gambling debts forced the family's hand. 6 months of coming home to my own space, of eating dinner without constant interruptions, of sleeping through the night without worry about what crisis might be waiting for me in the morning. 6 months of learning what it felt like to live, for myself rather than as an extension of other people's needs and expectations. The day I refused to fund Tyler's bailout, I drove home to my secret house and sat in my actual living room, surrounded by furniture I'd chosen and walls I'd painted, and felt the full weight of what I'd accomplished. I'd built a life they didn't know about, created stability they couldn't touch, established independence they couldn't manipulate away from me. But the secret was becoming a burden as much as a source of strength. Living a double life required constant vigilance, careful management of information, and an increasing sense of isolation from the people who were supposed to know me best. They thought they were talking to the old Sarah, the one who lived in a studio apartment and sent them money she couldn't afford. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd already moved on, who'd already chosen a different path. The confrontation at Thanksgiving would force all of that into the open. The careful balance I'd maintained between family loyalty and personal independence was about to collapse, and when it did, they would discover that their compliant, financially generous daughter had been building an escape route for 3 years. They thought they were punishing me by throwing me out of their house, by cutting me off from the family structure that had defined my entire life. They had no idea they were actually setting me free to live the life I'd already built without them. The manila envelope in my purse contained more than just a property deed. It contained proof that I'd outgrown them, evidence that I was capable of planning and executing a complex, long-term strategy without their input or approval. It contained the power to shift our entire family dynamic from one where they held all the cards to one where I controlled the most important card of all. But most importantly, it contained the key to my own front door, to a space where their guilt trips and manipulation tactics had no power, where their crises couldn't reach me unless I chose to let them in. The secret was about to become the truth, and the truth was about to change everything. The moment I pulled that manila envelope from my purse, the entire atmosphere in the dining room shifted like air pressure dropping before a tornado. 8 pairs of eyes locked onto the simple brown folder in my hands, and I could feel their confusion radiating across the table like heat from a furnace. They'd been so focused on their righteous anger, so certain of their moral superiority in casting out the selfish daughter, that they hadn't considered I might have cards of my own to play. "What's that?" Jennifer asked, lowering her phone for the first time since the confrontation began. Her voice carried that particular blend of curiosity and dread that comes when you sense something important is about to happen but can't quite figure out what. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let the silence stretch, savoring this moment of uncertainty on their faces. For 28 years, they'd held all the power in our family. Dynamic. They made the decisions, set the priorities, determined who deserved support, and who was expected to provide it. They'd grown comfortable in their roles, secure in the knowledge that I would always be there to clean up their messes and fund their mistakes. That comfort was about to die a very public death. "This," I said finally, holding up the envelope, "is something I've been meaning to share with the family for a while now. Since you're also concerned about my character and my loyalty, I thought this might be the perfect time." Uncle Marcus was still standing, his face purple with the exertion of his earlier shouting, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. "Sarah, if you think some kind of legal document is going to change the fact that you abandoned your brother in his time of need—" "Oh, it's definitely going to change things," I interrupted, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "Just not in the way you might expect." I opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, pulling out the document inside and unfolding it carefully. The paper crackled in the silence, each movement amplified by the tension in the room. I could see Mom leaning forward slightly, trying to read the text from across the table. Dad had stopped eating entirely, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth like he'd forgotten what he was doing. "This is a property deed," I announced, holding the document up so they could see the official letterhead and legal formatting. "For 1247 Maple Street. Purchased 8 months ago for the sum of $147,000. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I watched their faces as the implications slowly sank in, saw the exact moment when each person realized what I was telling them. Tyler's mouth actually fell open, a piece of stuffing visible on his tongue. Aunt Patricia's eyes went wide behind her reading glasses. "That's impossible," Mom whispered, her voice barely audible. "You live in that studio apartment downtown. You've been there for 2 years." "I lived there for 2 years," I corrected gently. "I moved out in March. I've been living in my own house for the past 8 months, the house I bought with the money you all assumed I was just sitting on, waiting for the next family emergency to drain my account." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. I could see them mentally recalculating everything they thought they knew about my financial situation, my living arrangements, my capability for independent planning. The reliable daughter who sent money home and lived modestly in a studio apartment had somehow acquired a 3-bedroom house without anyone noticing. "How?" Dad asked, his voice hoarse with shock. "How did you buy a house? The down payment alone would have been $30,000, I finished for him. Plus closing costs, inspection fees, and immediate repairs. All told, About $45,000 out of pocket, not counting the ongoing mortgage payments and maintenance costs. I let them process those numbers, watched them try to reconcile the financial resources I'd apparently had with the modest lifestyle they thought I was living. They were beginning to understand that their picture of my life had been fundamentally wrong, that the daughter they thought they knew had been living a completely different existence. "But how?" Mom repeated, her voice rising with what sounded like panic. "You were always sending us money, helping with expenses. When did you save? Enough to buy a house?" That's the beautiful thing about having a steady income and actually budgeting for your goals instead of throwing money at other people's poor decisions, I said, unable to keep a note of satisfaction out of my voice. It turns out that when you stop funding someone else's gambling addiction and failed business ventures, you can accomplish quite a lot with your own resources. Tyler finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "You've been lying to us for 8 months? "I haven't told you about my living situation," I corrected. "That's not the same as lying. You never asked where I was living. You just assumed I was still in the same place. Probably because it was more convenient for you to think of me as struggling financially rather than building wealth you couldn't access." The accusation hit its mark. I could see the guilt flickering across several faces as they realized how little attention they'd paid to my actual life versus my utility to their various crises. When was the last time any of them had asked about my job, my health, my happiness? When had they shown interest in my life beyond my ability to solve their problems? "This changes nothing," Marcus declared, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You still refuse to help your brother when he needed you most. Property ownership doesn't excuse abandoning family." "Actually, Uncle Marcus, it changes everything," I said, standing up and smoothing down my sweater. "Because this house, this financial independence, this stability I've built, it's proof that I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. You're not throwing me out of the family. You're releasing me from an obligation I never should have had in the first place." The shift in power was almost visible, like watching dominoes fall in reverse. Instead of being the desperate daughter, begging for acceptance, I'd become the successful adult who no longer needed their approval or support. Instead of being the family ATM, I was now the family member with the most assets and the clearest financial future. "You planned this, Patricia," said suddenly, her voice sharp with accusation. "You've been planning to abandon us all along. That's why you bought the house in secret. You were getting ready to cut us off." "I was getting ready to be independent," I replied. "There's a difference, though I can understand why you might confuse the two. Independence means I get to choose how to spend my time, money, and energy instead of having those choices made for me by other people's emergencies." Grandpa, who'd been silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke up. His voice was weak but clear, cutting through the chaos like a blade through fabric. "Sarah, your grandmother would be ashamed of what this family has become." The words hit everyone at the table, but they hit me differently than the others. Where they heard condemnation, I heard validation. Grandma Henderson had been the strongest woman I'd ever known, someone who'd raised 4 children during the Depression and never let anyone take advantage of her kindness. She would have been ashamed of what the family had become, but not because I'd finally learned to say no. She would have been ashamed that it took me so long to stand up for myself. "You're right, Grandpa," I said softly. She would be ashamed. She'd be ashamed that her granddaughter had to hide her success from her own family, because they saw her accomplishments as resources to be exploited rather than achievements to be celebrated. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Instead of the shocked quiet that follows an explosion, this was the heavy silence of recognition, of uncomfortable truths finally being spoken aloud. They were beginning to understand that their version of family loyalty had been fundamentally parasitic, that their support system had been built on the systematic exploitation of one person's resources and goodwill, and they were beginning to realize that person had just removed herself from their reach. The silence that followed my grandfather's words was different from anything I'd experienced in that house before. It wasn't the expectant quiet before someone delivered the next emotional blow, or the tense pause while someone gathered ammunition for their next attack. This was the silence of a house of cards collapsing in slow motion, each person at the table realizing that the foundation they'd built their family dynamics on had just crumbled beneath them. Mom was the first to break. Her face crumpled like wet paper, tears streaming down her cheeks as the full implications of what I'd revealed began to sink in. "Sarah, how could you do this to us? How could you let us worry about your future, your financial security, when you were living in a house this whole time? Do you have any idea how many sleepless nights I've had, wondering if you were okay living paycheck to paycheck?" The irony was breathtaking. Mom had lost sleep worrying about my fictional financial struggles while simultaneously expecting me to fund everyone else's very real financial disasters. She'd been concerned about my imaginary poverty while treating my actual money as a family resource available for Tyler's gambling debts and business failures. "When exactly were you worried about my financial security?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "Was it when you asked me to co-sign Tyler's car loan? Or when you needed $15,000 for his last business venture? Or maybe it was when you called last month asking for money to cover Tyler's gambling debts? Because it seems like you were only worried about my finances when they weren't available to solve everyone else's problems." Tyler had been unusually quiet since my revelation, but now he exploded with the fury of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled. "This is insane. You've been living like some kind of secret millionaire while watching our family struggle? While watching me almost get my legs broken by loan sharks? What kind of psychopath does that?" "The kind who learned that giving you money doesn't actually solve your problems. It just enables you to create bigger ones," I replied. "How much money have I given you over the years, Tyler? 20,000? 30? Did any of it actually help? You become more responsible? Or did it just make it easier for you to avoid facing the consequences of your choices?" His face flushed red, but he couldn't answer because we both knew the truth. Every dollar I'd given him had simply funded his next mistake, removed another natural consequence that might have forced him to grow up and take responsibility for his own life. Dad had been sitting in stunned silence, but now he stood up so abruptly that his chair nearly tipped over. "You selfish little girl," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "We raised you, fed you, clothed you, sent you to school. We supported you through your military service, through your injuries, through your difficult transition back to civilian life. And this is how you repay us? By lying to our faces and hoarding money while your own brother faces physical danger? You supported me through my military service?" I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make several people flinch. "Dad, you complained constantly about my deployment schedule interfering with family gatherings. You told me I was selfish for choosing the military over college. You said I was running away from my responsibilities. And when I came back injured and struggling with PTSD, you told me to get over it and stop dwelling on the past." The accusations hung in the air like toxic smoke. I could see family members glancing at each other, uncomfortable with having their revisionist history challenged so directly. They'd rewritten the past to cast themselves as supportive and me as ungrateful, but I'd been there for all of it. I remembered every dismissive comment, every time my trauma was minimized, every occasion when my service was treated as an inconvenience rather than a sacrifice. Aunt Patricia had been clutching her pearls literally throughout the confrontation, but now she leaned forward with the expression of someone about to deliver a killing blow. "Even if all of that is true," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "it doesn't change the fact that Tyler is in real danger right now. These aren't abstract philosophical arguments about family dynamics. These are concrete threats from dangerous people. Your brother could be seriously hurt because of your selfishness." There it was again. The ultimate manipulation, the nuclear option they pulled out whenever logical arguments failed. Tyler's safety, Tyler's life, Tyler's well-being hanging in. The balance while his cold, heartless sister counted her money and let him suffer. It was a powerful weapon because it contained just enough truth to make me doubt myself. But I'd had 8 months of therapy since my last deployment. 8 months of learning to recognize manipulation tactics and emotional blackmail. I'd spent countless hours talking to a therapist about combat trauma, but we'd also discussed family dynamics and the ways that emotional abuse could be just as damaging as physical violence. You know what's interesting about Tyler's dangerous situation? I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. He created it entirely by himself. He chose to gamble. He chose to bet money he didn't have. He chose to get involved with loan sharks. He made every single decision that led to this crisis. And somehow it's my responsibility to fix it? He's sick, Mom cried, her voice breaking with genuine anguish. Gambling addiction is a disease, Sarah. You wouldn't refuse to help if he had cancer or diabetes. This is the same thing. No, it's not the same thing, I replied firmly. Cancer patients don't choose to have cancer. Diabetics don't decide to become diabetic. But Tyler chose to place every single bet that got him into this situation. And more importantly, cancer patients follow their treatment plans. They take their medication, go to their appointments, make lifestyle changes to support their recovery. What has Tyler done to address his gambling addiction besides expect everyone else to pay for the consequences? The question silenced Mom because she knew the answer. Tyler hadn't entered treatment until after his debts were discovered. He hadn't made any meaningful changes to his lifestyle or his approach to money management. He'd simply expected the family to bail him out so he could continue living the same way that had created the problem in the first place. Jennifer had been filming parts of the confrontation on her phone, probably planning to post dramatic clips on social media, but now she was staring at me with something that looked almost like respect. "Damn, Sarah," she said quietly. "I never knew you had it in you." Had what in me? The ability to fight back. You've been letting everyone walk all over you for so long, I thought you actually liked being the family doormat. The comment stung, because it was accurate. I had let them walk all over me for years, because I'd been afraid of losing their love and acceptance. I'd confused being useful with being valued, mistaken being needed with being wanted. I'd thought that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, suffered enough, they would finally see me as worthy of their genuine affection. But sitting in that dining room, surrounded by people who were more angry about losing access to my money than they were proud of my achievements, I finally understood a fundamental truth about toxic family dynamics. You can't earn love from people who only value you for what you can provide. "You want to know what I've learned?" I said, standing up and smoothing down my dress. "I've learned that real family doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. Real family celebrates your successes instead of seeing them as resources to be exploited. Real family supports your growth instead of punishing you for becoming independent." The words hit them like physical blows. I could see the impact on their faces, the recognition that their version of family love had been conditional, transactional, dependent on my willingness to sacrifice my own well-being for their comfort. "And I've learned," I continued, "that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when they hate you for it." The room was completely silent now, the only sound the distant football game still playing on the television in the living room. 8 people sat frozen around a table loaded with food. None of them were eating anymore, processing the destruction of assumptions they'd held for decades. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more revelation that would complete their understanding of just how thoroughly their world had changed. I reached into my purse one more time and pulled out a second document, this one folded and worn from being carried around for weeks. The room tensed again, everyone bracing for another revelation they weren't prepared for. "There's one more thing you should probably know," I said, unfolding the paper with deliberate care. "This is a rental agreement for 412 Oak Street. The address meant nothing to most of them, but I watched Dad's face go white as recognition dawned. Mom's hand flew to her throat. "That's impossible," she whispered. "To Oak Street," I repeated slowly. "The house you've been renting for the past 3 years. The house where we're sitting right now, eating Thanksgiving dinner." The silence was deafening. "Henderson Property Management, LLC. That's my company. I bought this house 18 months ago when your previous landlord decided to sell." "I've been your landlord for a year and a half." Tyler's chair clattered as he jumped up. "You've been collecting rent from Mom and Dad?" "Market rate rent for a property I own, yes. Though I've been charging below market value because I thought I was helping family." The full scope of the power shift was sinking in now. They weren't just throwing their daughter out. They were trying to evict their landlord from her own property. "So when you demanded I leave," I continued, "you were trying to kick me out of my own house." I folded the documents and headed toward the door. "The rent's due on the 1st, as always. But given today's conversation, you might want to start looking for a new place." I walked out into the crisp November air, leaving my keys on their hallway table. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free. If this story inspired you to take control of your own life, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who've learned to put themselves first. Your future self will thank you.